In 1928, while waiting to be born yet and watching animation in Pixar's Soul Kingdom for the first time, called Steamboat Willie, I thought, what a waste of trees. However, computer graphics have since set the stage. Although I cannot say that today's workflow is more eco-friendly than legendary Walt Disney's methods, come on, 3D graphics are fun. It is time for the 50
most important 3D graphics concepts.
No matter which 3D software you use, in this case, I'll focus on Blender, as it's an excellent starting point for beginners. In Blender, the Viewport is your primary workspace, where you'll spend 90% of your time. You can navigate around your environment using pan, zoom, and orbit tools. By default, Blender provides a cube, which is one of the many primitives used for modeling, regardless of how complex your mesh is. Just as programming has built-in data types like integers, floats, and booleans, this is why we refer to them as primitives. Let's add a cone and sphere to our viewport, and automatically they are placed in the same spot as our cube. Any 3D viewport has two common methods for displaying objects: wireframe and solid. So if I turn on the wireframe, I can see through objects, while solid, a typical display, is to see the object's texture and color. We also have a separate tab, usually located in the top right corner, called the outliner, which lists all objects in the scene. Why do we need it? Select objects and establish parent-child relations. For instance, I set up the camera as a child of the cube, so they move together. Now let's select a cone and sphere and move them, rotate them around the pivot point, or scale them. These functions collectively form the transform tools, which are responsible for all object motion. Of course, you can select objects in the viewport through box, circle, or lasso selection tools. When looking at the viewport, we also see the camera and light, our sun. After selecting a light, in the bottom right corner, you'll see the Properties tab, which details the light settings, such as point, area, spot, and sun types, as well as power and radius. I'll select the sun and set it to 1000 watts. Now, I can render my scene. You'll get a nice picture, but how do you do it? The camera takes a picture, and the render engine, in this case Cycles, computes the relationships between objects and their properties. We also need to add color to our cube. Select the cube, go to Properties, and click on Materials. Then select the base color to be red. Render, and voila! Now why do we call it 3D? You're correct. These objects consist of vertices, edges, and faces, which define their three dimensions: length, width, and height. To construct great 3D models, you must enter Edit mode. Right next to Edit mode, you'll notice these cubes representing vertex, edge, and face select modes, which are essential for selecting and editing individual parts. Now, let's move to fun. In other words, the practical half of concepts. Now, what is the first thing coming to your mind you can model out of a cube? For me, it's a pyramid. I'll just select the uppermost face of the cube, then its vertices, and after snapping my cursor to the center of the cube, right-click and select Snap Vertices and Selection to Cursor. This action moves the vertices to the location of the cursor, which happens to be the center of the cube. Want to make it look like the Great Pyramid of Giza? For that, I'll need to apply a texture. Once again, I'll go to the Materials and click on the dot next to the base color, then select an image texture. Here is our render, which is divided into tons of pixels. Let's zoom in to understand what I mean. So, these are only 4 pixels. The result is not astonishing, I know, but believe me, I spent an hour searching for a decent picture on the internet. Then I'll save the blend file. Add primitive, a plane to a new Blender file. Oh, and remember, you should add objects and materials only in object mode because otherwise, objects will link. I'll enter edit mode and right-click to subdivide, which increases the number of cuts in the base 4. You can test with subdivide options here, and in my case, I modeled hillside environment. Sorry, I got distracted. I'll turn on proportional editing. Play with it, select the center vertex, and move it. This feature proportionally moves the parts of an object, instead of moving them together in equal distance. Now what is it? No, it's not gravity. So, I know you're saying, that's it. We only go to edit mode just for moving now vertices, edges, faces.
No!
Everything in the 3D virtual world can be modified using modifiers. We will cover basic ones, like deformers and physics, and quickly may run through other pro ones like hair, geometry nodes, and editors. First of all, deformers. We have an extrude tool, which transforms vertices into edges, edges into faces, and faces into meshes. Let's grab a monkey and place it here. Now look at the Timeline tab, which answers for animation and time. Turn on auto keying and insert the keyframe. Shift S. That's the first frame, and now let's go to 31st frame. Go to edit mode, select this edge and extrude it. See, it repeated that line over each other. Yes, we are opening box. Now delete this face and press Shift S. And render. Sorry, that was not intentional.
And at the time, he expressed the wish that all of you could see how these pictures were made.
We don't have to draw every image like Walt Disney did. Instead, we select only keyframes, and the software will create the animation for us. Another deformer, inset tool, that can add several faces to your mesh. To demonstrate its capability, let's grab a plane, go to edit mode, and inset it. After that, select all faces except the center, and extrude them, creating a pool. Let me show you how to create water or liquid using the physics modifier. Go to object mode, select the object, and click on Quick Effects and Quick Liquid Effects. This sets up the domain cube in the viewport, and its name also pops up here in the outliner. Our pool has become a flow by default, with the domain representing the territory within which the liquid should act, and the flow representing the water body itself. Think of it like a prisoner in a cell. I want to set up a pool as the domain and a cube as the flow. I will resize the cube to fit into the pool. And look at the Properties tab, Physics, and set it up as flow geometry. Then select our pool and assign it the role of the domain. Now, just go to Object in the Viewport tab, click on Animation, and finally, Bake Action. Play the animation of 80 frames, and you'll see it's quite satisfying. You might not have noticed, but Blender turned to wireframe display when adding liquid. When we make the scene solid, our cube suddenly appears, which we can make invisible by turning this on. Now let's zoom in on the animation. It may not look like liquid, but I assure you it will when rendered. Unfortunately, we'll cover that in our next 50 concepts. If you're hyped about part 2, drop a comment below. Back to the video. What are you seeing? Lots of particles are moving, right? We can also tweak the particles settings in the Properties tab, between modifiers and physics. Now, I'll make the particles big. Let's take a break from the overload and create a simple Uncle Steve Minecraft character, starting with his legs. Edit plane, then let's use my favorite tool, knife topology, to cut meshes. After cutting, I'll delete other faces and edges oblivious of a concept that we'll cover later. After extruding the final mesh, it came to me that I just could have used 2 edited cubes instead of this. Whatever. Now you know how to kill in 3D graphics. After modeling its head, body, and arms, which are of the exact size as his legs, and using a mirror tool for symmetrical arms. I applied texture to all of them and rendered this. It will be better, guys. Steve is human, right? Let's add hair physics. I select the upper face of his head, separate this mesh to assign hair only to that mesh, and extrude it a little bit. By the way, I could have used a separation strategy while modeling its legs. Look at hair. What do you see? Lots of curves, right? That's how they did Jake Sullivan and trees. Now, time for texture paint, where you can edit texture live. Keep in mind that the key to great render is texture, and for great texture, you should create a UV map, which is a flat representation of your 3D model. Imagine you have a wrapped box gift, where the box is your object, and wrapping paper is your texture, and you are using UV unwrapping to make this. You might be asking why we call it UV. No, turns out it is not ultraviolet, but simply word exhaustion. They used X, Y, Z symbols for coordinates, and the only math letters left were U and V. Okay, let's get to the UV operation. I figured it's better for Steve to have his hair like this, so let's replace his head with another cube, using a snap tool, then delete these cubes and hair. I'll select his head and go to UV editing, which opens a new window, where you see your childhood pastime, making a cube from these 6 paper faces. Then click here to open texture, then select each face and move it into where it should be. When it came to his left arm, I was trying to make its whole UV shape like a rectangle, but in vain. So, I ended up feeling unsatisfied. The right arm was less painful, as I decided to work with each face, based on my trauma with his left. We learn from our mistakes. Then I wrapped Steve's body into a shirt. Lastly, I scaled his legs UV and moved them onto here, and render. Suddenly, I had a question. Is his shirt a neck or shoulder too? I Googled and found this good neck plus shoulder shirt dynamic.
Niggas in my grill trying to phase me.
So far, we've covered 49 concepts. I'd be very pleased to make part 2 that will cover other deformers, physics, but mainly geometry nodes and shaders. Thank you for watching.